Okay, so I'm doing an impromptu Elite 8 late, and the last time that I did this last year, I split it into two different parts. Day 1 and day 2. I'm not going to do that, I'm just doing it all in one day. So these are the Elite 8 teams. Florida Atlantic, Kansas State, Yukon, Gonzaga, Creighton, San Diego State, Miami, and Texas, and we are done with the Elite Eight. We are moving on to the Final Four. So this is the Elite Eight lead and the Final Four preview. So just to review, here's last year's Elite Eight: Arkansas, Duke, Houston, Villanova, Miami, Kansas, North Carolina, and St. Peter's. If you notice that most of those aren't Florida Atlantic, Kansas State, Connecticut, Gonzaga, Creighton, San Diego State, or Texas, that is none of those names except for Miami, the Hurricanes of Florida. They are the only, and I mean the only school from last year to make it to this year's Elite Eight as well. And they did it better. Last year they were a 10 seed, and now they're a 5 seed. And this is the first tournament ever with no 1 seeds in the Elite, not the Elite 9, but in fact the Elite 8. And the seeds are a 2 threes, a 4, 2 fives, a 6, and a 9. Not as crazy as a 15 and a 10, but still crazy that there's no number 1 seeds. And as here's the how they get here part. Florida Atlantic barely survived Memphis, 18 Memphis. Then they got a 16 seed FDU after the craziest upset in history. And FDU really held their own. But Florida Atlantic beat them, and then they beat Tennessee. And in a thriller, they beat Kansas State yesterday, 79-76, meaning they're going into the Final Four having not won a tournament game before that. Kansas State, their opponent, beat Montana State. Pretty easy game, pretty guaranteed. Then they beat Blue Blood Kentucky, who wasn't in the Elite Eight. But, you know, am I even making the mic capture? The mic should be capturing. If it isn't, then I have to restart this entire thing. But yes, it is. I'm just making sure that it's checking. And then they beat Michigan State in an overtime thriller in the Sweet 16. And of course, they lost to, look at that, the 9 seed Florida Atlantic is going to the Final Four. And they were heavily underseeded. They were in the top 25. They have an incredible team. They should have been a 6 or a 7, even a 5. They were sorely underseeded. And they just showed that by making the first not seed. Yukon hasn't made it since 2014. That's a risky team. They were losing to Iona in the first half, but then they destroyed them in the second half. Destroyed St. Mary's, destroyed Arkansas, and as of yesterday, defeated Gonzaga by 28. A team rated higher than them by 28. And UConn is now moving on to the Final Four. Meanwhile, Gonzaga, the big Grand Canyon, Grand Canyon. Then they came back to beat TCU, and then came back to beat UCLA, and then they lost to UConn by 28, and they could not come back from down like 33, if I'm correct, was the largest lead. Gonzaga always chokes, and they have been to the Final Four twice, but they have still not won, which is crazy sad. Day 2 now. Creighton. They beat NC State. They were actually losing, but they ended up beating NC State. Then they beat Baylor, because Baylor, I talked about that last year in the Baylor Buccaneers video, defeating Princeton. They got the 15 seed Princeton, and then they lost to San Diego State by 1. And I just want to say in that game, I feel horrible if you're Ryan Nemhard, who made that foul, because it really just cost your team the game. The game would have gone to overtime, and you just let him make the score, and yeah, that is, and you got the tip off for you, and they just end the game. The refs were a little bit egregious, but I mean, that was a crazy game. As for San Diego State, they beat Creighton. They beat Charleston and Furman. They had it close with Charleston and then beat Furman after they crazily beat Virginia on a crazy pass, and they were no match for the Aztecs. And then they somehow beat 1 seed Alabama, and they played incredible defense in that game. There were so many wild possessions in that game. It's like, who has the ball? Who's the ball? Who wants the ball? Who's going to get it? Crazy. And then they beat Creighton by 1, and they are going to their first Final Four. So is Florida Atlantic. UConn is basically going. They haven't been since 2014. Miami beat Drake. They barely beat Drake, and then they owned Indiana in both the men's and women's tournament in the round of 32 as the lower seed both times. Coincidence? I think not. And then they beat Houston, number 1 seed Houston, taking out San Diego State, and Miami took out Alabama and Houston on the same day. And Purdue lost to FDU, and Kansas lost to Arkansas, so no 1 seeds there. And they beat Texas. Crazy. Texas was up by 13 in that game. Like 13. Maybe they would have been up by like 13, 15. And Miami came all the way back to win the game by 7. Speaking of Texas, they got Colgate. Then they crushed the toothpaste. And then they got Penn State. And then they got Xavier. And then they got Miami by choking the lead. I feel bad for the Horns. But that's why you use horns in battle. It's a burden. Okay, so that just leaves the Final Four to be Florida Atlantic, San Diego State, Miami, and Connecticut, and UConn. Florida Atlantic's a 9 seed. They hadn't won a tournament game before this, and they're going to their first Final Four. San Diego State is going to the Final Four for the first time. Miami is going to the Final Four for the first time, and might do it in the women's tournament, although I hope not, because LSU women's basketball is playing in that tournament, and UConn hasn't been since 2014. So, there's a 75% chance that a new champion is crowned today in the Final Four, but there's 25% chance. It is a strong 25% chance because Connecticut has blown everybody out. But I think Miami can beat them. A 4 versus a 5 and a 9 versus a 5. 2 5 seeds, a 9 and a 4 is the craziest and most unique Final Four I think I've ever seen. Last year's Final Four was a little bit more normal. But what happened to last year's Final Four? And I was actually at this Final Four in New Orleans in April for the semifinal games. Duke and North Carolina was crazy. Not so much with Kansas Villanova. Duke and Kansas both got eliminated in the round of 32. Duke by Tennessee and Kansas by Arkansas. North Carolina was famously on the tournament bubble, and then they missed the entire tournament. How do you go from going to the national championship to missing the tournament? And Villanova. I did not hear a single word about Villanova. They completely fell off the face of the earth. They didn't even make the tournament. I don't even know if they were close to making the tournament. Good Lord, they fell off the face of the earth. How do you do that? And I don't know. These 4 teams, this was a boring one. North Carolina was like an 8 seed. I think Villanova was a 2. Duke was a 1. And Kansas was a 1. Or maybe Duke was a 2. And Kansas was a 1. And North Carolina was an 8. And Villanova was a 2. If I'm correct, that's how the seeding went. More normal than a 9, a 5, a 4, and a 5. But I am in shock that none of these 4 teams even made a run. North Carolina and Villanova didn't even make the tournament, and Duke and Kansas didn't go far. Kansas was a 1 seed. And I suppose that is your Elite Eight late and your preview to the Final Four in Houston with FAU, Kansas State, UConn Gonzaga, Creighton San Diego State, Miami and Texas. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and mark off the teams that are eliminated. And that's a wrap.